Hank, the bull who learned to control his anger. If anger controls you, listen to this story. In a sprawling farm surrounded by lush green pastures and rolling hills, Hank the bull stood out as a symbol of strength and power. His muscular frame, gleaming coat and sharp horns made him the pride of the farm, at least in appearance. But behind this imposing exterior lay a personality that set Hank apart in a less admirable way. Hank had a temper, and it was as fierce as his strength. The other animals on the farm knew better than to cross him. A stray word, an accidental nudge, or even a misplaced glance could ignite his fury. When Hank got angry, it was as if a storm had descended upon the farm. His hooves would stomp, his nostrils would flare, and his deep, menacing bellows would echo across the fields, scattering the smaller animals in fear. Yet, Hank wasn't inherently mean-spirited. He didn't enjoy frightening the others, but his anger always seemed to get the better of him. Despite his occasional attempts to apologize, the damage was done. The sheep would huddle together, whispering nervously about his outbursts. The chickens avoided grazing near him, clucking about his unpredictability. Even the playful dogs, known for their endless energy and bravery, kept their distance when Hank was in one of his moods. Hank's days became increasingly lonely. He often found himself wandering the edges of the farm, gazing out at the horizon, his massive frame casting a long shadow. While the other animals gathered to share stories, graze, and play, Hank stood apart, pretending not to notice the lively chatter he was missing. Deep down, however, he longed to be a part of their world again. One afternoon, Hank noticed Luna, a gentle and kind-hearted duck waddling across the barnyard. She was one of the few animals who hadn't completely abandoned him. Luna's cheerful quacks often brought a glimmer of hope to Hank's otherwise somber days, but even Luna kept her visits short, sensing the storm that often brewed just beneath Hank's calm surface. Despite his growing isolation, Hank couldn't figure out how to change. He didn't understand why anger consumed him so easily, or why it left him feeling hollow afterward. To Hank, his temper felt like an unstoppable force, something beyond his control. That night, as the farm settled into a peaceful hush under the blanket of twilight, Hank stood alone beneath an old oak tree. He gazed up at the stars, his breath heavy with frustration. "Why am I like this?" he thought. "Why can't I just stop?" But the stars, in their silent brilliance, offered no answers. Hank didn't know it yet, but the journey to understanding and mastering his anger was about to begin. And it would change not only his life, but also the lives of every animal on the farm. The farm awoke with the golden light of dawn, its fields bustling with the sound of animals beginning their day. The chickens clucked excitedly as they pecked at the ground, the sheep bleated softly while grazing, and the pigs snorted in delight as they dug through the soil. But amidst the morning harmony, Hank stood apart, his broad shoulders slumped as he watched the scene from a distance. Hank's isolation had deepened over time. Each outburst left the other animals more wary of him, and his attempts to approach the group were met with awkward silences or hasty departures. But Hank, unwilling to admit his loneliness, convinced himself it was better this way. "They don't understand me," he muttered one morning, kicking at a patch of dirt. Yet trouble seemed to find Hank no matter how hard he tried to stay out of the way. That afternoon, while grazing near the pond, a young sheep named Milo accidentally bumped into him. Milo had been chasing a butterfly and didn't notice the massive bull in his path until it was too late. The sheep stumbled, his small body bouncing lightly off Hank's muscular side. "Watch where you're going!" Hank bellowed, his voice thundering across the field. His nostrils flared as he turned to face Milo, who froze in place, his eyes wide with fear. I'm sorry," Milo stammered, trembling under Hank's intense glare, but it was too late. Hank's temper ignited like dry straw in a flame. He stomped his hooves, causing the ground to quake, and let out a deafening roar. The other animals, startled by the commotion, stopped what they were doing to watch from a safe distance. Milo darted away, bleating in terror, while Hank stood in the middle of the field, fuming. The silence that followed was heavy. One by one, the animals began to scatter, avoiding Hank altogether. Even Luna, who had been nearby, quietly waddled away without her usual cheerful quack. As the sun dipped below the horizon that evening, Hank found himself alone again. The memory of Milo's terrified face played over and over in his mind. He knew he had overreacted, but the embarrassment of his actions kept him from apologizing. Instead, he let the anger simmer inside him, mingling with a growing sense of guilt. The days that followed were no better. Milo's encounter with Hank became the talk of the barnyard, and soon even the bravest animals avoided him entirely. Whispers followed him wherever he went, and no one dared meet his gaze. For the first time, Hank began to feel the full weight of his actions. It wasn't just about his temper anymore. It was about the rift it had created between him and everyone else. But what could he do? Hank didn't know how to fix the damage he had caused, and the thought of trying seemed as overwhelming as his anger itself. Unbeknownst to Hank, the seeds of change were being planted. The journey ahead would force him to face his temper head-on, but first, he had to hit rock bottom. The summer sun hung heavy in the sky, casting a harsh glare over the farm. The animals sought refuge under trees, near the pond, or in the cool shade of the barn. But Hank wandered aimlessly, his hooves stirring small clouds of dust as he walked. He avoided the usual gathering spots, knowing the others would scatter the moment he appeared. One afternoon, the tension reached a breaking point. While the other animals gathered in the barnyard for a game of tag, a rare moment of unity and joy, Hank stayed by the fence, watching from a distance. He told himself he didn't care about being excluded, but deep down, he yearned to join them. As the game unfolded, Hank's friend Luna waddled toward him. "Hank," she quacked softly, "why don't you come and play? It might be fun." Hank's ears twitched. For a brief moment he considered it, but then he remembered the looks of fear and judgment from the others. "No, thanks," he muttered. "I'm fine right here." Luna tilted her head, her eyes filled with concern. Before she could respond, a loud crash echoed from the barnyard. A wooden cart had tipped over, spilling its load of hay bales into the middle of the field. The sheep and chickens scattered, startled by the noise. Milo, the young sheep who had bumped into Hank days earlier, was trapped under one of the bales. His frightened bleats filled the air. Without thinking, Hank charged toward the chaos. His powerful hooves pounded the ground as he reached the overturned cart. The other animals froze, unsure whether Hank was there to help or if his anger would erupt once more. Hank lowered his horns and shoved the hay bale aside, freeing Milo. The young sheep scrambled to his feet, muttering a shaky "thank you" before darting away. But instead of feeling relief, Hank felt the familiar rush of frustration bubbling up. The other animals' hesitation to approach him stung. "Why are you all just standing there?" he snapped, his voice rising. "I just helped, didn't I?" The animals exchanged nervous glances before backing away. Hank's temper flared again, hotter and sharper than before. He let out a furious bellow and kicked the cart, sending it rolling across the field. "Fine," he shouted. "Stay away from me. I don't need any of you." Hank stormed off, his chest heaving with anger and hurt. He didn't stop until he reached the edge of the pasture, where an ancient oak tree stood alone. That night, as a fierce storm rolled in, Hank found himself huddled under the tree. Thunder roared overhead and lightning split the sky, illuminating the farm in brief, blinding flashes. As the rain poured down, Hank realized something profound. His anger wasn't just isolating him, it was consuming him. For the first time, he wondered if it was the storm within him, not the others, that kept him alone. The storm raged on through the night, the howling wind whipping through the trees and the rain drenching the farm. Hank remained under the oak tree, his massive frame hunched against the elements. The cold seeped into his bones, but it was nothing compared to the emptiness gnawing at his heart. As the first light of dawn broke through the clouds, Hank lifted his head. The farm was quiet, the air heavy with the aftermath of the storm. Branches and debris littered the fields, but the sight that caught Hank's attention was a massive tree split down the middle, struck by lightning. Hank approached the tree cautiously, his hooves sinking into the muddy ground. The once majestic oak, now broken and charred, seemed a fitting reflection of how he felt inside. He stood there for a long moment, his mind replaying the events of the past days. "Why does this keep happening?" he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why can't I stop myself?" A soft quack broke the silence, and Hank turned to see Luna waddling toward him. Despite the storm and the tension of the previous day, she had sought him out. "Hank," she said gently, her feathers still damp from the rain, "are you okay?" The bull's ears drooped, and he looked away. "Why do you care?" he asked gruffly. "I've scared everyone else away. Even Milo won't come near me." Luna tilted her head, her gaze steady. "Because I know you're not really as angry as you seem. You're just hurt." Hank snorted, the sound more out of frustration than dismissal. "What do you know about it?" Luna settled beside him, her small frame dwarfed by his. "I know that anger can feel like the easiest way to protect yourself, but it doesn't have to be. You can choose something else." Hank frowned, the words sinking into him like the rain into the earth. He wanted to dismiss her, to brush off her kindness, but something about the sincerity in her voice stopped him. "How?" he asked, his voice rough with uncertainty. "How do I stop being like this?" Luna quacked softly. "Maybe start by listening to yourself. The next time you feel angry, pause. Ask yourself why. Sometimes just understanding what's really upsetting you can make a big difference." Hank didn't respond immediately. Instead, he gazed at the broken tree, the weight of her words settling heavily on him. Could it really be that simple? As the sun climbed higher, casting light over the damp fields, Hank made a quiet decision. He didn't know if he could change, but he would try. For the first time in a long time, he felt a glimmer of hope, small and fragile, but real. And though he didn't realize it yet, that moment marked the beginning of his journey toward healing and self-control. A few days after the storm, the farm began to return to its usual rhythm. The animals worked together to clean up the mess, and the pastures started to look lively again. Hank, however, kept mostly to himself. Though Luna's words had sparked something within him, he still felt unsure about how to proceed. Early one morning, while grazing near the edge of the pasture, Hank noticed a figure approaching. It was Sabino, the oldest horse on the farm. Sabino's coat had grayed with age, and his steps were slower than they once were, but his eyes held a spark of wisdom. "Good morning, Hank," Sabino said, his deep, steady voice breaking the quiet. Hank nodded curtly. "Morning." The horse stopped beside him, surveying the landscape. "I've noticed you've been spending a lot of time alone lately," Sabino said. "Something on your mind?" Hank snorted. "What difference does it make? Everyone avoids me anyway. They think I'm just a big angry bull." Sabino chuckled softly. "Do you know what they used to call me when I was young?" he asked. Hank glanced at him, curious despite himself. "No." "They called me Sabino the Storm," the horse said, his voice tinged with a mix of humor and regret. "I had a temper that could rival yours. I'd kick down fences, rear up at the slightest provocation, and scare off anyone who dared to come close." Hank raised an eyebrow, surprised. "You? But you're calm." Sabino nodded. "Now, yes, but it took years of learning and a fair share of mistakes to get here. And I'd like to share something that helped me, if you're willing to listen." Hank hesitated, then gave a small nod. "I guess it couldn't hurt." Sabino stepped closer. "The next time you feel anger rising, stop and take a deep breath. Don't act right away. Count to 10 if you need to. Use that moment to think, not just about what made you angry, but about what you want to happen next. You'll be surprised how often a few seconds can change everything. Hank furrowed his brow. That's it? Just breathe and count? Sabino smiled knowingly. It may sound simple, but it's powerful. Anger is like a wildfire. It burns fast and destroys everything in its path. But if you can pause and control the spark before it spreads, you can save yourself and others a lot of pain. The bull considered this, the weight of Sabino's words settling in his chest. I don't know if I can do it, he admitted. Sabino placed a gentle hoof on Hank's shoulder. You can. It takes practice. But every time you choose to pause instead of react, you're taking a step toward mastering your anger. Start small, and the rest will follow. As Sabino walked away, Hank stood alone, the old horse's advice echoing in his mind. For the first time, he felt as though he had a tool, a way to begin changing. The path ahead still seemed daunting, but at least now, Hank knew where to start. The next morning, Hank rose with Sabino's words fresh in his mind. He didn't know how or when he would need them, but he resolved to try. The idea of breathing and counting seemed almost too simple, but deep down, Hank hoped it might be the key to the change he so desperately wanted. The opportunity came sooner than expected. As Hank grazed near the barn, a group of young goats scampered by, bleating and laughing as they played. One of them, an overly energetic kid named Pip, darted too close and headbutted Hank's leg in his excitement. Hey! Hank growled, his anger flaring. He lowered his head, ready to snap, but then he remembered Sabino's advice. He paused, inhaling deeply. 1 breath, 2, 3. The goats froze, their laughter dying as they watched Hank nervously. By the time he reached 10, the heat of his anger had cooled, replaced by a sense of clarity. It's fine, he muttered, shaking his head. Just be more careful next time. The goats blinked, their surprise evident. Pip quickly mumbled an apology before bounding away, but the encounter left Hank stunned. For the first time, he had stopped his temper from taking control. Over the following days, Hank practiced pausing and breathing every time frustration arose. At first, it was difficult. His instinct to lash out was strong, and there were moments when he slipped, his temper flaring briefly before he could rein it in. But each time he succeeded, he felt a small sense of accomplishment, a flicker of pride that kept him going. The other animals began to notice the change. The once terrifying bull who had driven them away with his outbursts now seemed calmer, curious, more approachable. One afternoon, as Hank rested under the oak tree, Luna waddled over and quacked cheerfully. You're different these days, she said. What's changed? Hank shrugged, though a small smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. I've been trying something Sabino taught me. It's not easy, but it's helping. Luna tilted her head, a glint of approval in her eyes. I can see that, and so can everyone else. Encouraged by her words, Hank began to interact more with the other animals. He joined them during their games, though he made sure to stay mindful of his emotions. Slowly but surely, the rift he had created began to heal. One day, Milo approached Hank timidly, his small frame trembling slightly. Hank, he said, I just wanted to say, thank you for helping me with the hay bales, and I'm sorry if I ever upset you. Hank looked down at the young sheep, his chest tightening. He took a deep breath before answering. You don't need to apologize, Milo. I should be the one saying sorry for everything. The sheep's face lit up, and Hank felt an unfamiliar warmth spread through him. It was the first time he had truly apologized, and it felt surprisingly good. The days turned into weeks, and Hank's practice became second nature. His transformation didn't just change how the others saw him, it changed how he saw himself. For the first time in his life, Hank felt a sense of peace he had never known. Weeks turned into months, and the farm buzzed with life and harmony. Hank, once the feared and avoided bull, was now a central figure in the community. The other animals sought his company, no longer wary of his temper. Even the youngest creatures, like Pip and Milo, felt safe playing around him, knowing that the days of explosive outbursts were behind him. Hank himself had transformed in ways he never thought possible. The technique Sabino had shared, breathing and counting, became his foundation. It wasn't a cure-all. There were still moments when irritation crept in, but Hank had learned how to respond instead of react. And in doing so, he discovered something profound. His strength wasn't in his ability to intimidate or overpower others, but in his ability to control himself. One crisp autumn morning, as the leaves fell gently from the trees, Sabino approached Hank near the pond. The old horse looked at him with pride. "You've come a long way," Sabino said, his voice warm. Hank nodded, a smile spreading across his face. "I couldn't have done it without your help, and Luna's. I owe both of you more than I can say." Sabino shook his head. "The credit is yours, Hank. Advice can guide, but change only happens when someone chooses it. And you did." Their conversation was interrupted by Luna, who waddled up with her usual cheerful energy. "Hank," she quacked, "you have to come to the barn. Milo has something for you." Curious, Hank followed Luna to the barn, where a group of animals had gathered. In the center stood Milo, holding a small wreath made of twigs and wildflowers. "We wanted to thank you, Hank," Milo said shyly, "for showing us that it's okay to change and that even the scariest storms can pass." He stepped forward and placed the wreath gently around Hank's horns. The barn erupted in cheers and quacks, clucks and bleats of approval. Hank's chest swelled with emotion as he looked at the animals surrounding him. For so long, he had felt like an outsider, a force of chaos that couldn't belong. But now, he was part of something bigger, a community that accepted and appreciated him for who he had become. Later that evening, as Hank stood under the oak tree that had once been his solitary refuge, he reflected on his journey. He realized that his transformation wasn't just about controlling his anger. It was about understanding himself, facing his fears, and choosing to be better every day. Hank looked up at the stars, the same ones he had questioned months ago, and smiled. "Thank you," he whispered, not to anyone in particular, but to the universe, to Sabino, to Luna, and to himself. The bull, who had once been ruled by his temper, now stood as a testament to the power of change. His story was a reminder that no matter how deep-rooted a struggle might feel, growth and transformation are always possible. And so, Hank's legacy on the farm became one of inspiration. The animals shared his story far and wide, teaching others that true strength lies not in domination, but in the courage to control one's inner storms.